Okay, so I agree with the overwhelming majority of what Kat said, and I probably won't focus on where I disagree with her because I haven't got enough time. But I wanted to start from a slightly different point of view, which was to talk about why I think if, as socialists, we want to attract other people coming in to struggle against the bedroom tax, against the pay freeze, against whatever's going on in their lives, to socialist ideas, we need to put the question of democracy at the centre of that. And I think that there's a real contradiction for capitalism which becomes more and more apparent as the crisis gets deeper. And personally, I don't talk about an economic crisis. I talk about an economic, ecological and political crisis because I think all of those things intersect in a way that we can't prioritise one of them. They all impact on people's lives across the globe. But capitalism says it's deeply democratic. It's a bizarre democracy. That, you know, in this country, people can be arrested for going on strike and having more than 6 people on a picket line. We've seen, you know, people being imprisoned for months for being on the streets of Manchester and other cities at the same time as riots were taking place. We're seeing people being deported on that basis. I mean, the criminality that capitalism imposes on ordinary working class people is vast, and those repressive laws are getting stronger and stronger. But I still think the majority of ordinary people think that we live in a deeply democratic. It's like they've appropriated that word from the working class movement, and I think that one of the things we need to do as socialists is to demand that word back. It's our word, it's not their word. You know, if you look at the things that the Chartists campaigned for all that time ago, actually most of those basic democratic demands have not been won. Nowhere in the world do you have recallable parliaments on the basis that they argued for and so on. And clearly, for many of us, our view of direct democracy, the sort of model that the Soviets represent, and other examples of direct democracy go far beyond that. So I do think that when Kat talks about the ideological crisis of capitalism, part of what we need to do is contest on that ideological level to say that the ideas of socialists are much, much more democratic than the ideas of capitalism. And we need to put that at the centre of our campaigning. And clearly, there's then a contradiction if our own organisations, whether we're talking about the organisations of the labour movement, the campaigns we're involved in, all socialist organisations as such, don't live up to the ideal that we're trying to present. Now, of course, there'll always be some contradictions between theory and practice, and I wouldn't pretend to claim that Socialist Resistance or the Fourth International, to which it belongs, has got everything right, because actually that would be stupid, because nobody ever gets. I mean, as I said, I was asked earlier in the meeting, had I finished reading Luke and Simon's book and what I thought about it, and I said, well, I didn't agree with everything in it, but then if I wrote a book, I probably wouldn't agree with everything in it by the time I got to the end of it. So, you know, that doesn't tell you very much. I think one of the things about the crisis in the SWP that comes up for me. Well, there are many things about that crisis that one could say. One of them, I think, is about the relationship that some people on the left have to the relationship between socialist organisations and the movement more generally. Again, Kat talks about the need for synthesis, which I think is absolutely right. But I think that the synthesis that a group of people inside a left organisation needs to make comes from the experience that those people, not just the ideas in their heads, but the real lived experience that those people have in the mass movement, whether that's the ideas that you get working in your trade union branch, where the majority of other people that you work with, even if you're in quite a large left organisation, are not going to be members of any left organisation. I've spent 35 years in revolutionary politics, and in that time, a lot of my political activity has been in the LGBTQ movement and in the women's movement. Most of the people I've worked with in those movements have not been members of left organisations, although some people have. But I think I've learned as an individual a huge amount from those movements. I'm also pleased to say that I think, while we haven't learned enough and there's things to go on learning, that the organisation I've been a member of has also learned from those movements. And I think that's sensible. If you're not, the second wave of the women's movement, which developed in Britain from the mid-70s and in the rest of Europe and North America at about the same sort of time, threw up a lot of challenges to the traditional left. Most of the women who were involved in setting up the women's movement in this country were people at the beginning who came out of left organisations, some of whom stayed in those organisations, but some of whom had had enough by that time of trying to fight sexism in their own organisations. And what does the left do every time a new if every time a new movement, whether it's the women's movement, the environmental movement, Occupy, whatever it is, when a new movement comes up, if the response of the left is to say, oh dear, this is a bit, we don't already have the answers in our briefcase, we better hide ourselves. Where's the synthesis? People create movements because those movements meet people's real needs. Doesn't mean that there aren't contradictions and conflicts within them. So, for example, on the question of organisation, one of the things that some of the debates in Occupy and other similar movements throughout the world reminded me of, and when Kat talks about, the resistance to politics, political parties, but also I think sometimes to any form, in some bits of the movement, not in all, to any sense of formal decision-making process, reminded me of a very powerful document, and I must put it up on Facebook and stuff, that was written by an activist in the women's liberation movement many years ago, called The Tyranny of Structurelessness, which was written by a woman called Jo Freeman. And what that document argues is that if you don't have any decision-making process and any process of accountability, then the voices that will get heard will be the people who've already got the power. And it won't allow the people who are less confident, who've had less access to education, whatever it is, to really participate in the movement, and therefore the movement won't genuinely reflect the interests of all its supporters. And we've seen, I'm not aware of issues having come up in Occupy in Britain, but certainly in Occupy in the States and in the Indignados movement in Southern Europe, we've seen huge problems of sexism expressed within the movement, where women and their supporters have been forced to fight again for the right to organise, and gains that we won back at the height of the women's liberation movement, but which got pushed back, and to actually assert that sexual harassment, sexist language and so on, is against the interests of anybody that's fighting for progressive politics. Because, you know, if we can't create a movement in which women are really able to participate, how on earth can we hope to change society? How on earth can we hope to really develop a vision of socialism for the 21st century that is going to attract the majority of people? And so one of the things that I would say, people have talked a lot, and I think rightly, about the importance of the right of tendencies and factions within revolutionary socialist organisations. And that's certainly something that the tradition in which I've been organised for 35 years has always supported. Although I also agree with Kat that it's not just about the formal rules, it's also about creating a real culture in which those things are genuinely open. But I also think that the right of the oppressed to organise, both within socialist organisations and within the movement as a whole, is also a fundamental democratic principle. And it's a democratic principle that not only women, in the case of women's caucuses, I would say, have a responsibility to argue for, but I think men have a responsibility to argue for. And it's an irony, for example, that in Britain today, not very democratic organisations like the trade union I belong to, Unison, gives me more democratic right to argue, to organise as a woman than some campaigns of the radical left. And that doesn't meet the criteria that I started with at the beginning of how can we show to people that our vision of the sort of society that we want to build is more likely to meet their needs than the ridiculously distorted society in which we live. So I think that the question of learning from the social movements in which we're all involved in, and they will be disparate, not everybody, I mean, unless you live in a very small place and where there's only one political meeting a night and you're also very committed and can go to them all, you can't possibly centralise the experience of everything that's going on. You can only do it by different people doing different things. And even if you do go to all the meetings, you're not necessarily going to pick up on everything everybody says. Everybody knows that some of the best discussions, well, in the old days the best discussions used to happen in the pub. These days some of the best discussions happen in the pub and some of them happen online when people have a chance to reflect about, you know, what happened in the meeting and draw out the lessons and conclusions. And hopefully we can do that in a constructive way where we learn from each other. So I think we're in a very contradictory situation now, because I think the depth of the crisis the multiple crisis of capitalism we face is undoubtedly very, very serious. And the disunity of the left, I think, does mean that some people who are really angry with what's happening in their lives and what's happening in the lives of other people around them don't have the confidence to get involved because they don't see movements moving forward. And even amongst those people who do get involved in the campaigns that are in their doorstep, people are less likely to get involved in left groups because of the disunity. But on the other hand, I do see, not only around the SWP crisis, I think it was starting in the issues that some of the comrades from the ACI were starting to raise before that. I haven't read the last Lear book, I must get it. There have been a number of these discussions, I think, going on for a while, and I think these are discussions that all of us need to participate in. For myself, I think the question of revolutionary unity and the question of building a broad party have to be taken together, but that's the subject for another discussion or possibly for the book.
Thank you.